the brooch hit the ballroom floor before anyone understood what had just happened. One moment it was pinned to the lapel of Neve Alderton Cross's black blazer, small, old, the kind of thing that looked out of place in a room full of women wearing real jewelry, and the next, it was skidding across the travertine tiles of the Fairmont's grand ballroom, catching a flash of chandelier light before it came to rest near the base of a champagne display. Portia Strand, 32-year-old brand strategist and Dashiell Cross's mistress, had not meant for it to look like an accident. She had simply reached past Neve to gesture towards something on the nearby display table, broad, careless, the movement of a woman who had decided that other people's space did not apply to her. And her wrist had caught the pin clasp. The brooch had flown. For one breath, the nearby conversation stopped. Neve Alderton Cross, 36-year-old wife of Dashiell Cross, and the silent controlling owner of the Alderton Group, a real estate development company valued at $1.8 billion, did not move immediately. She stood in the center of that small silence, with her hands at her sides and her eyes on the floor, on the small piece of antique enamel lying face down near someone else's feet. To most of the room, the brooch was nothing. A grandmother's trinket. A sentimental thing with no business being in a room where women came dressed in stones that cost more than most people's mortgages. The Alderton Group's year-end investor reception at the Fairmont Royal York in Toronto was not a room that made space for plain things. But Neve knew what the brooch was. It had been the first piece Glenys Alderton had ever worn to a public signing, the closing of the original land parcel that became the company's foundation 4 decades earlier. A small enamel pin, shaped like a simple arch, pressed copper beneath the glaze, barely 2 centimeters wide. Glenys had pinned it to her coat the morning the lawyers handed her the keys to the first building she had ever built from nothing. And she had worn it every time she signed something that mattered after that. When she passed the company to her daughter Fiora, she passed the brooch with it. When Fiora's health had started to fail 8 years ago, she had pressed it into Neve's palm in the back room of the Alderton Group's archive office and said quietly that the company would always know its own. Neve bent down and picked it up herself. Nobody offered to help. Dashiell Cross, 38-year-old husband of Neve and the Cross family's most ambitious face, stood a few steps away beside Sylvette Cross, his 64-year-old mother. Sylvette held a glass of champagne with the ease of a woman who had decided long ago that expensive rooms were simply her natural habitat. She watched Neve retrieve the brooch the way one watches a housekeeper pick up something she dropped, briefly, without concern. It's fine, Portia said, not sounding sorry. She smiled at the small cluster of investors near the display table. She's very attached to her little antiques. Laughter moved through the group. Light, polite, the kind that does not acknowledge itself as cruelty. Neve stood up straight. She held the brooch in her closed hand. She looked at Dashiell, not with a question, not with a plea, but with the patience of a woman who already knew the answer. He looked back at her with a tightening at the jaw that had nothing to do with guilt. Don't make it a thing, he said, low enough that it was only for her. Tonight's important. She looked at him for one more second, then she pinned the brooch back onto her lapel herself, quietly, and turned away. 2 weeks before that night, Neve had been standing in the archive room on the 4th floor of the Alderton Group's head office, Bay Street, when the first warning had reached her. The message came from a number she did not recognize. Your husband's family is telling investors they have a private mandate from Alderton. You need to know what's being said before Thursday. She had read it twice, then put the phone face down on the archive table. Huxley Crane, 55-year-old public chairman of the Alderton Group, and the man who had served as the visible face of the company throughout the years Neve had chosen to remain behind the Alderton Private Trust, looked up from the quarterly portfolio spread before him. Something wrong. Not yet, Neve said. The Alderton Private Trust was not a secret in the legal sense. Any lawyer who pulled the right filings could find it. But in the way the world actually worked, in the way investment circles and dinner party conversations operated, it was invisible. The trust held the controlling shares of the Alderton Group. Neve was the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. Huxley chaired the company publicly. Only a small circle inside the building knew whose signature actually moved everything. Her mother had set it up that way after her own diagnosis, wanting to protect the company from speculation and what Fiora had called the particular hunger of people who assume a sick woman's company is for the taking. Neve had kept the structure, not because she was afraid, but because being unknown had given her room to learn. She had walked into every department of the company without a title attached to her name and understood, by the time she was 30, how every piece of it worked. She knew the contractors, the project managers, the legal team, the land acquisition specialists. She knew the building codes for 3 provinces. She knew which projects were running over budget and why, and she knew which managers were worth keeping. What she had not known was that Dashiell had started using the Alderton name in rooms she was not in. She had married him 5 years ago, when he was still a mid-level associate at a commercial real estate brokerage, before the ambition had settled into something harder. He had been warm then, careful with her time, interested in what she thought. Somewhere in the years since, listening had stopped. The warmth had become performance, and the performance had been redirected toward people whose approval he valued more. She had told herself it was the industry, the pressure. She had covered small failures of his quietly, the way people cover things they hope will heal on their own. Then Huxley's contact on the investment circuit forwarded an email from Colin Brast, 44-year-old commercial investment advisor and Dashiell's longest-standing business connection, describing the Cross family's close strategic alignment with Alderton Group leadership and their unique proximity to Alderton's private development pipeline. The email included language that bordered on a formal representation. One paragraph suggested Dashiell had early visibility into Alderton's next major land acquisition. Niamh read the email 3 times, then she asked Huxley to verify whether any authorization had been issued. None had. Not a memo, not a letter, not even a courtesy copy. She photographed the email, saved it to the Trust's secure file, and said nothing to Dashiell. At the investor reception, 3 days before the brooch was knocked from her lapel, Niamh had stood in the Fairmont's pre-function corridor and watched through a gap in the draping, while Sylvette held court beside a window overlooking Front Street. The Cross family's involvement with Alderton is at a very private level, Sylvette was telling a small group that included 2 pension fund managers and a family office director. Dashiell is not someone who makes noise about these things. That's the Alderton culture, quiet, substantial, long-term. They are not a flashy company. Colin stood nearby nodding, with the composed ease of a man who had decided that a half-truth, told confidently enough, was simply a version of the truth. Niamh stepped back from the draping and took a slow breath. She had spent 5 years introducing herself to people in Dashiell's world as his wife. She had done it without resentment and without strategy, because she had believed, for a long time, that the marriage and the company existed in separate rooms. What she understood now, watching her mother-in-law speak about Alderton the way one speaks about something one has earned, was that the rooms had never been separate. Dashiell had simply been using a door Niamh had not known she had left unlocked. She took her phone out of her bag and sent Huxley a single message: begin the process. The brooch had already been weakened before the gala night. Niamh had discovered it the evening she was dressing. She had lifted it from its case and felt the pin mechanism give slightly under pressure, a small looseness that was not there the week before. The hinge had been pressed inward, not worn down, pressed deliberately. She had photographed it from 4 angles and sent the images to Sasha Oren, 41-year-old Alderton archive curator, the keeper of every original document, artifact and provenance record in the company's history. Sasha called within minutes. "The pin mechanism has been forced," Sasha said. Her voice was careful, but the anger was underneath it. "If someone pulls at it, it will give. Can it survive the evening? If no one touches it?" Niamh looked at the brooch resting in her palm. She thought of her grandmother pressing it into her mother's hands. She thought of her mother pressing it into hers. "I'm wearing it," she said. Niamh. "It's evidence either way," Niamh said, "and I would like to still be wearing it when the truth comes out." She had already spoken to Waverley Prynne, 52-year-old private attorney and the legal mind who had managed the Alderton Trust since Fiora's illness. The photograph had been time-stamped and filed. Waverley had notified Huxley to preserve every camera angle inside the reception venue. The brooch held through the drinks hour. It held through dinner. It came loose in the exact moment Portia decided that Niamh's space was available for her use. After she retrieved it and pinned it back, Niamh excused herself from the table and stepped into the corridor near the coat check. She stood there for a moment with her palm flat against her own chest, feeling the cold edge of the enamel through the wool of her blazer. She heard Portia's laughter coming from inside the ballroom. She heard Sylvette's voice, lifted by champagne and attention, saying something about partnerships and proximity. She heard, at a lower register, Dashiell accepting congratulations for something he had not done. She sent Huxley a second message: preserve the drop, whatever angle caught it. Then she went back inside. She stayed until the end, because leaving early would have looked like retreat, and she was not retreating. On the drive home, Dashiell told her she had embarrassed him by not engaging properly with the investors. She said nothing. When they arrived at the house, he went into his office, and she went into the room she kept for herself at the back of the upper floor, where she had a desk and a wall of her mother's sketches and a locked drawer with documents that Dashiell had never thought to ask about. She sat at the desk and opened the file she had been building for 3 weeks. The file was not made of anger, it was made of evidence. Photographs of the weakened brooch clasp, forwarded emails from Colin's investment pitches, a recording from a venture capital dinner, provided by a contact of Huxley's who had been present, of Dashiell describing the Cross family's foundational relationship with Alderton's senior trust structure, a screenshot of Sylvette's social profile, where she had recently updated her biography to include the phrase associated with Alderton Group, Toronto. And then the 3 records Waverley had assembled. The quiet financial settlement Niamh had covered 2 years ago, when Dashiell's brokerage deal had collapsed, and he had owed money to 3 different parties. The private loan that had funded the Cross family's renovation of their Rosedale home. The management fee Niamh had arranged through the trust for a Cross-adjacent consulting firm that had otherwise been failing. She had done all of it without announcement. She had done it because she had believed in those years that love which required proof was not love at all. She looked at the file for a long time. Then she closed it and turned off the desk lamp. Outside, the first snow of December was coming down over the city in the quiet way Toronto snow sometimes does before it decides whether to be beautiful or inconvenient. She picked up her phone and called Waverley. "Tell me what you need from me," she said. "Your signature," Waverley said. "When you're ready." "I'm ready," Niamh said. The next 17 days moved in 2 separate currents. In one current, Dashiell told people Niamh was unwell. A vague, managed thing he said with a sad tilt to his mouth, as if her emotions were simply larger than rooms like these could accommodate. Sylvette repeated it at lunches and charity committees. Portia posted photographs of herself beside Dashiell at events Niamh had not been invited to, and under one she wrote, "Some women know how to stand in a room." Colin continued sending investment materials that described the Cross family's Alderton relationship in language that grew, with each version slightly more formal. In the other current, Niamh arrived at the Alderton offices before anyone else each morning. She met with Huxley and Waverley in the boardroom with no exterior windows. She reviewed the evidence with Sasha, who had pulled provenance documentation for the brooch going back to the company's founding charter. She read transcripts of Colin's pitch meetings. She signed the divorce preparation papers Waverley had ready. And she approved the program for the Alderton Group's annual development announcement, a public event held each year in January to unveil the company's major projects for the coming year, attended by clients, investors, city officials, media, and the broader Toronto real estate and construction community. This year, the program would include one addition that had never appeared before. For the first time in the company's history, the Alderton Group's controlling owner would be publicly introduced. Dashiell received his invitation by courier. It was printed on heavy cardstock with the Alderton crest, the same crest that appeared on every building the company had completed in 4 provinces. His name appeared in the guest category listed as Investor Community, General. Colin called him within an hour of delivery. "Front row access. This confirms everything we've been saying." Sylvette drove over from her condo to look at the invitation in person, as if seeing it physically made the proximity more real. Dashiell studied the card at his desk. Something about it made him uneasy in a way he could not immediately name. He turned it over. The back listed the evening's program. The final item read, "Presentation by the Alderton Group's controlling principal, Alderton Private Trust." He had heard that phrase before. The Alderton Private Trust. It existed somewhere in the background of conversations Niamh occasionally had, the ones that ended when he walked into the room. He had never asked. The name had always seemed to belong to a layer of the company that did not concern him. He put the card down and went back to his email. On the night of the announcement, the Alderton Group had taken over the main hall of a building they had developed themselves. A former warehouse in the distillery district that the company had converted into a cultural and events complex a decade earlier. The space was theirs in every meaningful sense. The reclaimed brick walls, the Douglas fir ceiling beams, the skylights Niamh's mother had fought to preserve against the original design team's objections. Niamh had been 26 when that project finished. She remembered standing inside it the first time the lights came on. The room was full by the time the program began. Dashiell and Sylvette sat in the third row, with Colin on one side and Portia on the other. Portia wore a structured blazer and had her hair pulled back in the way of a woman expecting to be photographed. Sylvette sat with perfect posture and scanned the room with the satisfaction of someone who believed she was exactly where she was meant to be. Niamh was not visible anywhere in the hall. Dashiell scanned for her twice, then decided she had probably stayed home. The program moved through its segments. Project completions, community partnership announcements, the land acquisition summary for the coming year, a sustainability report from the development team. Huxley presented each section with the composed authority that had made him an effective public chair for 12 years. Investors made notes. City officials nodded at the parts that involved their jurisdictions. Then Huxley stepped back from the podium. The lights in the hall shifted, lowering over the audience and brightening slightly on the stage. A large screen behind the podium illuminated. "Before we close the evening," Huxley said, "the Alderton Group will make an introduction that is long overdue." The screen displayed a single line. Niamh Alderton Cross, Controlling Principal, Alderton Private Trust, Sole Trustee of the Alderton Group. The room went quiet. Dashiell's hand resting on his knee went very still. Sylvette turned to look at Colin. Colin was already reading the screen a second time, his expression collapsing from confidence into something he could not organize fast enough to hide. Portia's mouth opened slightly. She closed it, then opened it again. Niamh walked onto the stage. She wore a dark blazer, and on the lapel, pinned with its usual small precision, was the brooch. The enamel arch caught the stage lighting, and from the third row, Dashiell saw it clearly. He recognized it. He had seen it 100 times and never once asked what it was. The room rose. Not all at once, not in one coordinated motion, but in the gradual way that happens when people realize, one by one, that they are in the presence of something that matters. Clients who had worked with the Alderton Group for years. Project managers who had spent months on her builds without knowing the name of the person whose signature cleared their budgets. Journalists who had covered the company through 2 market cycles. They rose. Niamh stood at the podium and waited for the room to settle. "The Alderton Group was built by my grandmother," she said. "She bought the first parcel of land in this city with money she had saved over 11 years. She had no investors, no family backing, and no safety net. She built the first building herself, or nearly. She hired 2 contractors, both of whom she paid on time and in full, which she said was the beginning of every honest business relationship." The room was silent. "My mother ran this company after her. She did it through market downturns and through an illness that took most of the last decade of her life. She never sold a building that was not finished to the standard she had promised. She never walked away from a commitment because it became inconvenient." Niamh touched the brooch at her lapel. "This belonged to my grandmother. She wore it the morning she signed the papers for her first project. My mother wore it after her. I have worn it every day since my mother died." She paused. "Last month, at a company event, it was knocked from my jacket by someone who found it amusing that I would wear something so plain to a room like that." On the screen behind her, a still image appeared, the gala ballroom, Portia's wrist in motion, the brooch mid-air. Portia stood up. A security officer near the aisle moved, not touching her, simply being present. She sat back down. "I want to be clear," Niamh continued. "The Alderton Group has not issued any private mandate to any individual or family outside this company. It has not entered any partnership arrangement through informal or social channels. It has not granted any investor group early access to development pipeline information or private trust communications. Any claims suggesting otherwise are not authorized, are not accurate, and are being reviewed by our legal team." Huxley stepped forward with a folder. Waverley, seated near the stage, opened a matching file. Dashiell looked at the folder. He looked at Niamh. He looked at the screen, where the image of Portia's hand and the falling brooch had been replaced by a simple line. "Alderton Group. All representations must be authorized by the controlling trust principal." Colin's phone buzzed. An investor whose name he recognized had sent one line, withdrawing from all cross-discussions. Effective immediately. Another buzz, then another. By the time the program concluded, 3 separate investor groups had sent written withdrawal notices. The Cross family's listed affiliation on Colin's materials had been formally contradicted on record at a public event attended by journalists and city officials. Sylvette would need to update her social biography. Portia's presence in the gala photograph, alongside Waverley's documentation of the brooch's deliberate weakening, had been submitted to the company's legal team as the first element of a civil claim. Neve stepped down from the stage and did not look toward the third row. Looking would have made it about them, and it was not about them. Dashiell found her in the corridor outside the main hall. He had left Sylvette and Colin and Portia inside. He moved quickly, the way men move when they are trying to regain ground they have not yet admitted to losing. Neve. She stopped. When she turned, her face was composed in the way it had been composed for most of the past month. Not cold, not angry, simply present. "You should have told me," he said, "about all of it. The trust, the shares, what you actually are to this company." "I told you I worked here," she said. "You decided that meant I was below you." His jaw moved. "That's not fair." "You told your mother's friends you had private access to Alderton's development pipeline," Neve said. "You let Portia knock a family heirloom off my jacket and told me not to make it a thing. You allowed a fraudulent investment brief to circulate under your broker's name for 6 weeks." She held his gaze steadily. "Tell me which part of that is unfair." He had no answer. Or he had one, but it required an honesty he had not practiced in long enough that he could not locate it quickly. Waverley appeared at the end of the corridor with a document envelope. A process server stood beside him. Dashiell saw the envelope. "Is that?" "Divorce petition," Waverley said simply, "and a legal hold on all communications and materials that include the Alderton name issued by any party connected to the Cross family." The process server placed the envelope in Dashiell's hands. He held it with both hands, as if weight was something he needed to account for suddenly. Neve watched him, the way she had watched him in the early years, looking for the person she had believed was there. She had loved him genuinely. She had helped him genuinely. She had wanted for years to believe that the kindness she had extended had landed somewhere real inside him. What she saw now was a man holding papers and calculating what they cost him, not what they had cost her. "I never needed you to be important," she said quietly. "I only needed you to be honest." She walked past him toward the exit. Outside, the January air came in sharp and clean over the distillery district's courtyard. The old brick buildings lit warm against the dark. Neve stood on the stone pavers for a moment. The cold came in through the front of her blazer. She put her hand over the brooch, the way she had put her hand over it the night her mother fastened it around her, and stood there until her breathing was steady. She was not crying, or she was a little, in the private way that the cold sometimes makes hard to distinguish from wind. Behind her, inside the hall, Huxley was already fielding questions from investors who understand what the trust's public presence would mean for development timelines. Sasha had prepared a provenance summary of the brooch for submission to the legal claim file. Waverley had a second sealed envelope ready for Colin Brast. 3 weeks later, the Alderton Group announced the Glenys Alderton Foundation, named for Neve's grandmother and dedicated to supporting women in the skilled trades. Construction workers, site supervisors, project managers, and engineers navigating industries that had not yet fully learned to make room for them. The brooch was donated to the company archive, where Sasha mounted it beside the original founding charter beneath a soft case light with a provenance label that told the full history. Not just the early decades, all of it. Neve came to look at it on a quiet Tuesday morning when the building was not yet fully awake. She stood in front of the case for a long time. Her grandmother had built the first building with no safety net. Her mother had held the company together with no margin for weakness. And Neve had stood in rooms full of people who believed she was decoration, who broke what they thought was worthless, who mistook her patience for permission. She put her hand against the glass of the case, just briefly, the way one acknowledges something that cannot be held anymore, and then turned and walked toward the boardroom where the next meeting was already waiting. She had always been the one running it.